Hello and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. My name is Sunny and today I am bringing to you a bunch of Asian American book recommendations. So books by Asian American authors or by Asian authors in particular. Some of these authors aren't Asian American, but they are by Asian writers. So let's just get into all of these recommendations. This is, I think, like every book that I own that is written by an Asian person, I'm pretty sure. So this is like my whole collection. Just kidding, I'm realizing there are a couple I'm missing. Let me go grab them off my shelf. Okay, here's the full stack. Every book that I own written by an Asian author. These are all East Asian and Southeast Asian authors, and so yeah, let's just get into it. The first book I have here is The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. This is translated from Japanese, and it is this magical realism sort of piece that it feels very surreal and removed in some ways, but is also very dystopian, and people would call it Kafka-esque, I think, or actually Orwellian. But this book is set in a country that is like a small island in which the memories of specific things will keep disappearing. So like one day everyone will wake up and no one will have remembered, everyone will have forgotten the smell of like roses or the existence of roses, for example. Or, one day everyone wakes up and, the existence of purple has been eradicated from everyone's memories. And this is all maintained through this shadowy, sort of omnipresent memory police. And we're following a novelist and her editor as she attempts to continue living her life as things get progressively worse and more things keep disappearing. And she develops this relationship with her editor throughout this book. It's very vague and again surreal, but it has a moving sort of premise and feeling and aesthetic to it, I think. And that sort of distance between you and the prose allows for the reader to exist in that weird metaphysicality of what this book is exploring, because essentially I think one day novels become eradicated by the memory police, and one day everyone wakes up and novels no longer exist, and so what do you do then as a novelist? So this sort of follows that. It's very quiet, and it's very quiet despite the dystopian premise, but yeah, it's very sort of disturbingly enjoyable, if that makes sense. I'm gonna move through these recs because I have so many pretty quickly, and it's gonna be in a totally random order because it's literally just a bunch of books off my shelf. So, disclaimer. Next I have Flowers in Mold by Ha Seong-nan. This is translated from Korean, and this is a short story collection, a lot of weird, surrealist sort of fiction, and we're following a bunch of different characters as they move about their lives in different scenarios. There's a gymnast, a story, there's a story that follows a bunch of these tenants who sort of come together to try to kill their landlord. There's a story about a man who goes through his neighbor's garbage. It is quite disturbing, but also pretty quiet, and I think if you like kind of weird, unsettling fiction, you should pick this up. Korean translated lit. This is also by a woman author. If you're looking for Women in Translation Month reads, here you go. Next up we have another short story collection. This one is science fiction. Exhalation by Ted Chiang. I've talked about this a lot on this channel. This is a fantastic science fiction short story collection with some of my favorite short stories ever in here. It deals with a lot of existential questions in such a narratively fascinating way. Linguistics and time and family, relationships, communications. There's this one, I think there's like a heist story in here that is amazing. a lot of dealing with like technology and how it impacts people's relationships with each other, history and memory and belief and religion, spirituality, science, all of these things in a way that is like mind-blowing and spectacular, but also so minute, grounded, and real in terms of how it deals with the reality of people's lives and the mundane. It's very brilliant, I would say. And next we have Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, An Asian American Reckoning. This is a memoir type personal essay collection, and this is about Asian American identity and history and our author's experiences going to college and getting, I think, her MFA in poetry, and with her struggle with mental health and her family, all these things that are really interesting. There's some sort of textual analysis and art criticism in here, as well as a sort of glance over historiography of Asian Americanness and gender as, you know, an Asian American woman. There's some really poignant and interesting and smart racial commentary that goes on here, as well as just this very internal, introspective look into this one woman's mind and how she reflects upon her own experiences and identity. Of course, it talks about her Asian American experience, her Korean American experience as, I think, the child of immigrants and, you know, moving about the world in this way, and her memories of different like scenes and dialogue and experiences that she's had in a poetic manner, because I think she's, you know, a poet. So very interesting and a moving, compelling read. The next book I have here is a poetry collection called Floating Brilliant Gone by Franny Choi. This is a poetry collection that feels very fairy tale-like and ethereal and deals with Korean American womanhood and Asian American womanhood in this very interesting, introspective, moving way. I really like her poetry collection Soft Science as well, which is inspired by Ex Machina in some ways, and the sort of techno-orientalist fetishization of Asian women and what that means for Asian American women. And this poetry collection gives us a glimpse into her earlier work before that, and I remember reading this when I was a lot younger and being really moved by it. Oh, to the man who shouted, "I like pork fried rice" at me on the street. You want to eat me out of these jeans and into something a little cheaper, more digestible, more bite-sized, more, come, I'm greasy for you. Slick my hair with MSG every morning, I'm bad for you. Red light district stuck in your teeth. Taste like a takeout box between my legs. Taste like dried squid, lips puffy with salt, brimming with foreign. So call me pork. So call me pork, curly-tailed obscenity, been playing in the mud, dirty meat, worms in your stomach, give you a fever, dead meat, butchered girl chopped up and cradled in styrofoam for you, candid cannibal. Want me bite-sized, no eyes to claw your throat. But I've been watching from the slaughterhouse ever since you named me edible. Think you're the first to sit at this table to ask for a cookie at the end? Call yourself lucky, chef, archaeologist, any name to thicken your jaw. And there's a lot of different illustrations and stuff in here too that make up the poetry, and there's this text and visual element that is pretty interesting. So if you like poetry, you should pick this up if you haven't already. And next I have another science fiction fantasy short story collection, The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. I also talked about this in another video in which I talked about Exhalation by Ted Chiang, my science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction short story collection recommendation video. But this book has a lot of fantastic, really interesting stories that deal with technology and the future and human relationships as these things are implicated into them, and history and memory and how they're passed down, with some stories that deal with ghosts and memories and within particular spaces and times that are so rich and immersive. And it's just really interesting in dealing with the ideas behind all of these different situations that each of these stories detail out, while also, you know, it deals with like the complex, sophisticated, big ideas while also dealing with the sort of complicated, sophisticated, individual day-to-day actions of people and why they do the things they do and how they communicate with each other. And these characters all feel really real and memorable. I still remember a lot of these stories, even though I read this a while back. There was one about this girl who is a filmmaker and goes to an interview for this filmmaking company, one of the best film production companies in the world, and she discovers things that makes her question a lot of things. There's a story that has 3 or 4 parts to it, past, present, and future almost, of the descendants of one family, and now they're in space, and then how they view their history versus the actual lineage of their families. It's really interesting. So many of these stories are so brilliant in the way that they embody science fiction as a genre. So, amazing. Sort of a hard bent. We got Harley Quinn, Breaking Glass by Mariko Tamaki, and this is a graphic novel that sort of retells the story of Harley Quinn, but as a teenager, so there's no Joker in here, really. I mean, well, there is, but it's not like a romance story. She goes to high school and she befriends Poison Ivy, who is like a teen activist type who has a community garden with her family, and Harley Quinn has been sent away into New York City away from her mom for the school semester because her mom's doing some crazy shit, and Harley is subletting from these drag queens, and they also are fighting this landlord. So it's a lot of these things that are really fun and interesting, and it's also illustrated in full color in this really pretty and compelling way. The character design is really fun, and the whole narrative is just so engrossing and a fun time. I love Harley Quinn as a character so much, and I think Mariko Tamaki does a good job of imbuing Harley Quinn in this rendition of her high school self in this alternate sort of Gotham with a reality and sense of life and truth that is authentic to her character while still feeling original and fresh. And it's something that I don't think you have to have any real familiarity with the DC universe. I didn't really when I picked this up, and you would still enjoy it as a story on its own about a teenage girl who's in a new high school setting, trying to make friends, trying to figure out what the hell is going on, trying to just, make do with what she has. And yeah, I really hope there's another installment of this graphic novel. I don't know. I liked it. Alright, and now we have a historical fiction novel, Pachinko, Min-Jin Lee, a very popular book, a historical novel that spans many generations, and each chapter follows a different generation, a different individual perspective, and they're all connected back to this one matrilineal line of this one woman who sort of runs away from her small Korean island and goes to Japan and lives in Japan in the sort of ghettos where the Koreans are, and then World War II breaks out, and all these things happen, and it all follows all the way up to the present when, the accumulated wealth and been able to move out and now live in the US, and we're sort of seeing that progression and how we got there in this linear time frame that is so moving and feels so dynamic and true and authentic in a way that you can tell that the author did so much research and knows so much about this particular history and is such an expert on it, and it's just this grand sort of story that feels very cinematic, and it's engrossing. When you pick it up, you just don't want to put it down again because everyone's story in this is so interesting and you want to see where each one follows to the next. I think it got adapted to a TV show actually. So yeah, I mean, it's a good story. Next up, we got Chemistry by Wei-Kei Wong. This book is a literary fiction novel that is contemporary and is following this grad student who is studying chemistry, obviously, and she drops out or is in the process of doing so. She's sort of ended her relationship with her fiance. She's Chinese American and her fiance is white, I think, and he and her have sort of ended things. She is dealing with a sense of loss of identity, or, you know, she's dealing a lot with like mental health issues. She is reflecting on her past. There's a lot of like chapter breaks and paragraph breaks throughout here. So it's a pretty easy read. It's not easy. It's like sad and disconnected, short sentences a lot. There's some playing with language and Chinese, and, you know, that diasporic identity, that family relationship, that daughter parent relationship. And it's very, very touching and feels so genuine and personal about, you know, trying to live up to family expectations, but also trying to cope with like life when it's so hard for you to just live and like keep living and finding the will to live, you know? So this was a really touching and deeply moving novel that I really resonated with. Next book I want to talk about is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. This book is, I think, a book I talked about in my hyped books that I would recommend video, probably, because it is very hyped. It's been adapted to a TV show that people love. It is a good book. I enjoyed it. I think that the way that it tells the story that it sets out to tell, and the way that these characters interact with each other, and how the story of these families all overlap across time, is just brilliant. And the way that it sort of culminates in this big event of this house burning down, which we see a glimpse of at the beginning and then get the full story of at the end, is brilliant. I think the way that we look at that suburban repression, that construction of like white womanhood, the way that like liberal white saviorism exists, how the existence and positionality of like women of color within these spaces and within their particular situations, and how that makes it tricky as everything plays out. So fascinating and gripping. And the way that the author plays with perspective, I still think about how deftly it was done. The narrative and perspective and point of view sort of wielded very sharply. And I think that's what makes this book so good in particular. Next book I want to talk about is another sort of depressed woman moving type of book, and that's Pizza Girl by Jean Kyung Fraser. This is about an 18-year-old pregnant pizza girl. She is half Asian, half white. Her dad was an alcoholic and he died somewhat recently. She's living with her mom and her boyfriend, the baby daddy, and she has graduated high school, but she's still living in LA, which is where she went to high school with. So she's like still running into people, and it's hell for her. And it has this like sort of the same tone of just a young woman who is just not happy with her life and very unsatisfied, very unfulfilled, and but her relationships with her mom and her boyfriend aren't like necessarily fraught. I mean, they are, but emotionally on her own end, they don't actually have conflict or tension within them necessarily. It's just that she herself is just really fucked up. All right, and the next book I want to talk about is Gods of Want by K. Ming Chang. This is a short story collection that is very magical realism and surreal, but it deals a lot with Asian American identity in particular, intergenerational relationships, lesbian identity, queer identity. All of these different stories follow different young women usually, and their sort of gross and strange lives, desires, wants, experiences. The language is so rich and dense. I highlighted a lot of stuff. I thought that it felt almost like a poetry collection at points. The way that the titles would play into the stories, the way that the stories were constructed, the way that the language played out. But the narratives within the narratives and the stories within the stories were themselves so compelling and vivid and painted out in this way that was like gorgeous. For example, so this one story is called Nine-Headed Birds. I just flipped to a random one, and it starts off with, "My Jojo always said I would be stolen by a nine-headed bird, the kind of bird that spurred the sky into night. looking for girls to kidnap from their beds. Technically, all 9-headed birds are born with 10 heads, but one of the heads is severed, its neck hailing blood into houses below, lashing the morning red. That's what rust is, blood born from the 10th neck. So a lot of these sentences and the visual images that these sentences draw out are very vivid and striking and disturbing. There's a lot of language that's like very gross and sickening, but in a way that like is still very compelling, and I really enjoyed it for the way that it sort of draws out desire and family and these relationships that are so formative to us. Next, we have a young adult science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction novel, The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He. This book was so interesting, and I don't think I get enough credit for how big-brained it is. Like, it's very, very... It has lofty goals, and it has a really steep premise, and it delivers in many ways while not being too heavy or gratuitous or heavy-handed, I think. It is about these sisters who are both stranded from each other, one on an island, one in this eco-city. She's dealing with loss, grief, privilege, her relationship with her father that's sort of removed and distant, and the strained relationship that the loss of her mom and her sister has put on her family, and the dynamics within her friendships and stuff within the eco-city. And then we get the survivalist sort of feel of this girl who wakes up with no memory, and she's on this island, and the only thing she remembers is that she has to get to her sister. And as these timelines merge, as these perspectives come together, the reader comes to understand things about this world and the way that it's constructed, and the way that the technology and the ecological destruction of this future, it's not even a dystopia, it's just sort of an imagination of an extension of what our future could look like, that is so interesting and does so much for a young adult novel, and still focuses on that sense of self and isolation and loss, grief, dealing with the stakes of the morality of like the world. What does that mean? Especially because, you know, one of these girls is kind of like a mad scientist type, is very smart, and she sort of, and her father is one of the head scientists and engineers on the EcoCity programs, and she's dealing with like, well, how do I figure into all of this? How do I feel about the way that all of this exists in the world? Especially when there's inherently inequality in its distribution of its resources. So it's very interesting and compelling, and I don't think it's given enough credit for how smart it is, honestly. All right, we got another magical realism science fiction book here, Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. I did a book look for this actually on my Instagram a couple years ago. This is a more lighthearted, not even lighthearted, it's tonally more jubilant and joyful, I think, but it is a sort of, it follows these different perspectives that does a good job of merging them, because they all exist at the crossroads and intersections of like meeting each other. There's this space alien family fleeing this war, the refugees of this like space war from other galaxies. We don't get that many details about it because it's not that important, because they end up taking over this donut shop, and this donut shop is also a central figure configuration within the storylines of the other main characters, which is this Japanese violin teacher who has sold her soul to the devil. In order to earn it back, she has to give the devil the souls of like 7 prodigy violin students, and she only needs one more prodigy violin student before she can get like her soul back or whatever. And so the student that she finds, that she scouts out, is this trans girl who has run away from home and is homeless. It's all set in San Francisco, I believe. And she's this young Asian trans girl, and she just brought her violin with her, and she is a prodigy, and the teacher sort of overhears her playing in the park one day and then takes her on as a student. And then we see everything that plays out. It's not very slice of life, but it's sort of like an elevated slice of life. It's sort of what happens as these things merge. And there is, of course, the element of science fiction of like, oh, there's this space alien thing. There's the fantasy of like, okay, there's like the devil here and there's magic at play. But the music element is underlying all of this. The queer themes of everything here is so interesting. I thought that this was such a heartwarming and genuine tale that was really enjoyable and beautiful and gorgeously rendered. And then we have a science fiction fantasy novella called The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zensha, which I also did a book look for like 3 years ago because this cover is gorgeous. But this is set in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and it's following this group of bandits and this monk type person who like joins them, and she's like the one girl in this group of like dudes, and they're trying to go on this like quest almost. There's a spiritual element to it because of like the monk. It's very found family. It has this like jaunty, eclectic vibe. There's a sense of almost like a fable in some ways. There's a sacred magical object that needs to be protected. They're sort of, it's very short. It's really fun, but also kind of dark at points, and it has this rich sort of setting that it also makes the humorous parts of it stand out in a way that's really livening. Next, I have the young adult novel Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, which I also did a book look for. I swear I don't do this for everything, but this one is a historical fiction novel set in the 50s, and it is set during the Red Scare, and so our Chinese American teenage main character, she is the daughter of a doctor and a nurse, I believe, and her family's getting investigated for alleged sympathies with like the Chinese Communist Party or whatever the fuck, and there's that going on. But also it's fundamentally a romance story because our main character discovers her lesbian identity, her femme identity, and goes to a lesbian bar and discovers femme butch culture and all of the realities of being a lesbian in San Francisco in the 50s, being a teenage Chinese American girl, and all these different things that are just like very gorgeously and beautifully rendered, that tells the story of this girl in coming of age in a way that's like, it's so compelling narratively and historically well researched. Melinda Lowe actually gave a talk that I went to, and the way that she presented all of the research she did for this book was so brilliant, and it's all on her website as well. I think the different places that it's supposed to be set. It is a pretty brilliant young adult novel. I get why it's so hyped. I think it deserves it, and this is a very special book because I know that it's gonna help so many young lesbians come to terms with their identities, I think, because it feels genuine in a way that is about storytelling first and foremost, and that conveys history and narrative in a way that's like, it's powerful, it's meaningful. Next up, we got a literary fiction novel, New Waves by Kevin Wen. This book is about this is from the perspective of a man who works at a software engineering company, I believe, or some sort of tech company as like a more lowly customer service assistant, and he is Asian American, and he and his friend at the company, who is a Black woman, she works in the software engineering department, they are friends and they sort of bond over being like minorities within the tech industry in, I think, again, San Francisco is where this is set. But towards the beginning of the book, his friend dies in a car accident, and so this book is about the process of grief and mourning, what it means to lose a person, especially within the context of like technology, because there's a plot line about how his friend and him tried to like break into the building or something. I read this a while back, but it was a solid not literary fiction novel that dealt with a lot of really interesting themes about like contemporary realities of tech companies and race and class and of course the thematic underlying element of this whole story, which is grief and losing someone, especially because they didn't really have that much of a compassionate, tender relationship. It was almost like it was just like a work friendship that came out of necessity in some ways. But yeah, it was pretty moving without being too like saccharine. It was very straightforward in many ways. And finally, I have Siren Queen by Nevo, which is one of my favorite books of last year, 2022. And actually, this is the book look a little bit. I changed some things, but this is the book look inspired by this cover. Do we see the similarity? Do we see the resemblance? Like, am I giving her? Is she giving me? Anyway, this book is a historical magical realism set in the golden age of Hollywood, following this Chinese American girl who is actress. We follow her from young childhood as she grows up in her family and then gets into the industry, and she basically like makes a deal with the devil. No, she makes a deal with like the witch. She trades some years off her life or something in order for her to get roles. There's all these different little magical elements that are fairy tale like and very dark and grotesque that get sneaked in throughout the whole backdrop of this glamorous Hollywood scene. And it's beautiful, it's lesbian, it's noir in a way, and I enjoyed it a lot because it was my favorites of last year. I think the writing is gorgeous, and the imagery and the interactions, the dialogue, the way that it portrays Hollywood at this time. I think Nevo is pretty brilliant at doing historical fiction with a touch of fantasy. All right, so those are all of the Asian American books I have on my red bookshelf. Those are my recommendations for you. I hope all of these little mini pitches made sense and that you got some book recs out of this. If you've read any of these books, let me know down in the comments which ones and what you've thought of them. Or if you haven't heard of some of these, let me know which ones you would want to pick up now. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in another video soon. Please subscribe and like this video. Until then, I will say goodbye. Mwah.